Dad had ordered loads of pizzas 'cause what we was starving, and Mum had been prowling around the front door looking down the lane waiting for them to come. Granny had been thinking and had been using the computer and making bets with hundreds of bookies all over the world on about going to space, but what it was exactly she wouldn't say. Auntie Myrtle was knitting, Uncle Ted was polishing up his spare wooden leg, Grandad was asleep on the sofa, and you and me were kicking each other 'cause we were bored and hungry. "The pizzas have come," Mum shouted, and we all piled out into the yard. There was a posh car coming up the lane, and Dad said it was a bit posh for a pizza delivery, but Mum said who cares so long as they got the ruddy pizzas. The car stopped, and two men got out, and they was in suits and ties and shoes and looked dead serious, and Mum said, "Where's the pizzas then?" And they looked confused and said, "Are you the Potts family?" And Mum said, "Who wants to know?" And they said what they came from the Russian embassy. And Mum said, "What's the Russian embassy doing delivering pizzas?" But they said they didn't have any pizzas. And Grandad said that's typical of Russians, you couldn't trust them, and he had fought them in the war. And Mum said he wasn't in the ruddy war. But Grandad said that's not the point. They didn't have any pizzas, so that proved it. And Dad said that that's right. And Mum said to mind his own business. What did he know? And they started to shout, and you started to cry, and I said you were a baby, and you said you wasn't, so we fought, and Uncle Ted waved his spare wooden leg around and said bugger, and Auntie Myrtle said he shouldn't speak like that in front of the kids and weren't right, and everybody was yelling, and the Russians just stood there looking at us, shaking their heads and looking confused. After a bit, Mum said to the Russians, what were they still doing here if they didn't have any pizzas? And they said they didn't know nowt about pizzas, but what they was going to take us into space, 'cause they knew what Granny had been on the computer and had got on to bookies and bet what the Potts family would go into space, and the bookies reckoned that was unlikely, so they gave Granny fantastic odds. So, if we did go into space, Granny would win billions and billions, and that would pay for a rocket and everything and make Russia famous, and we'd be famous as well, and on telly. And Mum looked sort of interested then and said, "Is that right?" The Russians said it was right, and people, especially the bookies, was going to be surprised. I said I had been on telly, so I knew all about it. And they put powder on your face, and the Russians said when was I on telly, and I said when I did conducting, but they looked doubtful. Mum said it was all very well, but she weren't going nowhere until she got her pizzas, but the Russians said we'd pick up some pizzas on the way and don't worry and come with them. So we all got in their car and we drove down the lane, but then there was two little motorbikes coming up the lane, and they was piled with pizzas, so we shouted at the Russians to turn around and follow the pizzas, but they didn't want to, but Granny started keening and that scared them, and we said she wouldn't stop until she had been fed, so they turned the car around and we chased the bikes, and Dad was leaning over and honking the horn, and Mum was shouting out of the window, and it was a right carry-on. And the pizza deliverers looked behind them and saw us coming and got scared and turned their bikes around and went back down the lane. Granny hooked the Russian driver out of his seat with her hook, and Uncle Ted whacked him on the head with his wooden leg, and Granny took over the driving, accelerated, and did a handbrake turn what bounced us off walls and spun us around, and we chased the pizza deliverers, but one went left and another went right, and we went straight on and through a hedge and into a field. The fields were muddy and horrible and full of green leafy stuff what were growing in mud. The car sank in the mud and we got out and we looked at the green stuff. Then Mum says, "That's it, I've bloomin' had it," and starts kicking the green stuff and swearing, and Dad says, "What's the problem?" and Mum shouts, "Just bloomin' look," and she pulls leaves up from the ground and waves them around and yells what it's ruddy spinach, and it was. There was nothing but spinach for miles around, and Mum sits down in the mud and starts crying, and that was just the start, because Granny had been thinking, and when Granny has been thinking, things can get right hairy.